Finally. Thank you everyone for being here. I understand this may not be the most passionate topic about Sociology Sports Congress, especially since I'm going to talk to you about semiotics for 15 minutes. I'm going to try myself because I talk a lot. So, I am Sebastián Chávez. I come from the Polytechnical University of Madrid. And I'm going to tell you about how to apply specifically visual semiotics to the study of sports and body semiotics. So, because this is a Sociology of Sports Congress, all of us may not know what semiotics is. So I'm going to give you a brief rundown on what semiotics is. So, here. So, semiotics is basically the study of science, which proposes that we can study any particular cultural artifact as a text. And if we can do that, it means that it has a structure, and that structure has some implications. So, in order to identify those implications, we have to divide whatever we're studying between what is signified, which is the method representation of what we mean, and the signifier, so the specific object that we use. So for instance, our method representation for screen may be something that projects an image, and the word screen would be the signifier. Okay? So, in that vein, we have that visual science can be also read as a text because we can identify a grammar to visual culture and visual artifacts. In this sense, we can say that all texts and all images have a rhetoric, have a narrative behind them that may not be evident at first, but because of the way the image is constructed, how it's structured, we can read some implications into them, whatever they are. So, we have two levels, which is the denotation level, which is what is explicitly stated, and the connotation level, which is what is implied in that text. Okay? So, in that sense, we also have in semiotics this analysis of syntagmatic elements, which are the specific elements that construct these phrases, these semiotic phrases, and we have the pragmatic elements, which are the elements that are implying a certain ideology behind them. So, how has visual semiotics been applied to martial arts, which is my topic of research? We have that for martial art, it's what is called a multimodal utterances, because in martial arts we have movements, we have a visual culture, we have materials, we have certain ways of expression, we have certain specific commands, so we cannot just look at one. We could, but in the concept of body culture, we try to look at the most elements that we can humanly analyze, because all of us, we are short on time always, and we don't have resources many times. So, just for a bit of context, I put three martial arts, but I'm going to talk about Aikido. So Aikido is a martial art in which their practitioners go and they flow with the movements and try to wrestle each other to the ground by doing some blocks and throws. And one of these researchers found out that from a semiotic perspective, all of the movement, like for instance, stepping this way, so in a posture that is called hanmi in Japanese, are reflecting of facing a sword with your body, while your hand becomes a sword itself, as a representation of that, even though it's just a piece of flesh. Okay? So, while the contributions of some other semioticians have been very valuable to martial arts studies, there's this consistent problem that they don't tend to explicitly state how exactly they do their research. They usually have this problem of taking a leap between the hand movement or the body movement or the words they use to the theory that they apply in order to interpret this phenomenon. So, this makes it very hard for someone who is not very into semiotics, so for someone who comes from outside visual culture, and sociology for that matter, to understand exactly how can you apply this method to visual culture. How will you do it if you don't have a clear blueprint on how to do it exactly? Because of that, it sometimes, many times it feels in the context of sociology of sports and sociology of body culture that these applications of theory may feel a bit ungrounded. So we have the specific empirical data here and the theory here. And sometimes feel like they are stretching a bit their data to make it coherent with the theory they are using. So, because of this, this presentation takes place as the final part of my thesis, finally, in which I found this problem, saying, now for the last part of my thesis, I want to analyze the visual culture of kendo, which is Japanese fencing. Here's a nice picture of me doing kendo, by the way. So it's coherent with the previous steps of my research, which were participant observation and interviewing the practitioners in Spain. But I didn't find a coherent or clear methodology to do that, to take that approach, that sequential approach. So, in order to do that, I spent a few months thinking, okay, should I drop this? Should I leave semiotics behind? Or maybe I can give it a second try and invent a methodology or propose a methodology for these purposes. So I chose that right. So, how was this done? As for the data collection, this was a sampling by convenience. So I used whatever material was available in the context of Spain, mostly because that's where my ethnography was based. And because of many times having very little material available, I stretched the possible universe of videos to Europe. Okay, that search was done between September and October of last year, and I used these keywords in order to find these videos on YouTube. So España, Spain in English, CI, Kata, Bokuni Yoru, Kendo in Japanese writing, Spain, Europe, etc. So for the materials, this is going to be very quick. So I used OpenShot 3.1, Google Sheets, the version of 2026, K Text Writer, and KDE Plasma as an operating system to run the analysis on. And this is the overall context on where this research took place. So this is basically my guiding question of my thesis: how is correct kendo actually reproduced in tutorial practices by kendokas, so by kendo practitioners? Which meant that I had to characterize separately how is practiced, what's the discourse around kendo, and how it's represented. So in this third spot is where all of the previous steps come from, so representation. So the question would be then, in this third part, how to semiotically and specifically represent a methodology for studying the visual culture of kendo. Okay, and how to represent kendo in its most highly form of aesthetics, which was divided in their three versions. So kendo shiai, which is a competition, kendo traditional kata, and kendo contemporary kata, which are set sequences in pairs. So just for context, for those of you who don't know kendo, which I am going to guess is most of you, kendo is contemporary Japanese fencing, which was in its modern version, was created during the 20th century after the standardization of kenjutsu, which is the technique of the sword, so what samurai used, in order to be taught at schools during the preface of Second World War, as a tool also for Japanese imperialism and its expansion to the east of Asia, from their point of view. And then in its contemporary version, which is post-war kendo, it got democratized, and many of the military aspects of kendo were taken down and made much into a sport. So, this is the two kinds of versions of kendo I was talking about. So in kendo shiai, you use an armor to hit certain parts or the others of one's body for a maximum of 3 points. So if you get 2 points on the other person, you win. And for kendo kata, which is a set of pre-established sequences, you only use uniform, okay, and a wooden sword. So for the CI, I analyzed both the female and male finals of the Spanish championship, and here's it's just so for you to show how I divided these combats in order to count the utterances of people, so it's points, which kind of techniques were used, which were them uncommon or not. I created also a scale on the different aspects that are judged when scoring a point, which are used by the judges, and how this was analyzed in the specific way judges use. So it was kind of not of a problem to create these scales and divisions. But for the case of traditional kendo, the traditional kendo kata, there was no standardized way to analyze this. So I took inspiration in the way of kendo CI, how it's analyzed, and I also created a scale of the different elements. This is how it looks like the actual analysis. And then some content analysis of how many times they were in proper distance, they hit with proper strength, etc. And you can see how much of a mess this was because it was so many categories. And then, as for the contemporary kendo kata, which were created in order to teach the transition from using a sword to using a bamboo sword, which is used in kendo for hitting, because you're not going to hit the other person with a wooden sword because you're going to break their bones. Basically, I had to make a mix between the CI criteria and the traditional kata criteria because there is no empirical research on this. This is completely new, or not that is accessible at least. So I also created a gradation of the different aspects here. This is for you to see how the actual table looks like when analyzing all of these separately per each video and per each role that is played in each kata. There's a receiving end and a hitting end. More of the same. Nightmare I went through. And as for how to apply this criteria to actually writing and describing the results, what I have here is that from a descriptive aspect only, that for CI, usually kendo tend to strike in a direct manner, and that's the most common score they make. And they use a very specific way to use tensas in order to be proficient and striking and given the scores. As for the traditional kata, overall the highest standard of each single aspect of it is not usually represented. So kendoka have an idealized version in their heads of how this looks, but when it comes to reality, it's mostly about somewhat feeling in intermediate ways, so not gripping the sword properly all of the time, and the screaming, the kata-oe, not always being super loud. And for the contemporary kata, it's surprisingly usually more consistent than the traditional one in the sense that it has a higher level of accomplishment when it comes to their higher degrees of aesthetics. Now, for the word interpretation, so we are moving one level above. As for CI, it was very evident that there were some elements of this analysis that are heavily reliant on the experience, both on the judges and also the researcher, because in my case, I am a kendo fourth dan and also been a judge at national championships, so I know there is a huge bias there about you needing some actual kendo experience to do this analysis. Again, and for traditional kata, there are some attitudinal aspects that make the full understanding of kata by practitioners not always complete. And for the last one, is clear that there is a transference between the kendo you use as a bamboo sword with and the wooden sword with. And for the final bits, again, one step above, how to understand kendo culture is that from the videos alone, we cannot really infer the the combat culture that this has behind it, even though it has been historically recorded. As for the aesthetics of kendo, we can just say that there is a sense of naturalness, rhythm, grace that is very embedded in these practices. And for the definition of the limit of art, so because there is this discourse about martial arts being art, it shows that there is a symbolizing function on the case of kendo that can actually be a support for the idea that this is also a form of art, bodily art. So, so finally, we have that. Basically, we have to be very aware of how these deeper ideas that we may have beforehand from reading theory may or may not be actually present in the research that we do, and also that we have to be transparent about how we apply theory from the ground up. And as for conclusion, we have that it's critical for the actual data we analyze and how we analyze it is coherent then with the levels of theory that we're applying. That the visual semiotic method can be applied for sports culture, and fortunately, because kendo being such an obscure art that really none of you know up to this point, if this is possible with kendo, then it means that it is possible to translate that into sports that are more widely common and more widely recognized in a much more simple manner. And that's it. Thank you very much.